Grow CFO is where finance leaders grow together. Join thousands of like-minded professionals using Grow CFO to access the combined knowledge and experience of the finance leader community. You can join us today, growcfo.net.
Hello and welcome to the Grow CFO show. I'm your host, Kevin Appleby, and this week we're talking about real estate, property, an area that the CFO often gets really involved in because there's nobody else doing it in the company. But with me, I've got a real estate expert. I've got Scot Ginsburg. Scott, tell me about you and what makes you an expert in real estate.
Yeah, well, first, Kevin, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be on the show. Just quick background on myself. I'm 52. For the last 25 years, all I've been doing, representing companies, tenants, not landlords, who lease real estate and occupy it, or buy real estate and occupy it. I'm from Southern California. I handle companies nationally and internationally. And my undergraduate work was in the sciences. I was a pre-med student. Late 90s came around, the internet boom. A friend of mine was in law school a year ahead of me. He called me up. I'm a self-taught tech nerd. He wanted to start an online auction company. So we had one. We raised a little bit of seed capital. And there was my first introduction to commercial real estate. So I found the advisor that I was using, representing our firm. It was a two-man shop, completely on an uneven playing field, whereby the broker was representing the landlord. I was the tenant. I was left to do the thing on my own, and ultimately just got a horrible deal. And fast forward, the company folded. We went out of business. The dot bomb obviously blew up, as we all know. But fast forward, I always had an interest in real estate. They just kind of family affairs, friends were in the business. When I interviewed at several firms, it was explained to me, hey, you can go into investing, underwriting, you can go into brokerage, represent apartments, commercial real estate, office, industrial, technology, life science, multifamily, you name it. Or you can do tenant representation. And the tenant representation stuck to me because, to your point, I realized companies, aside from the big corporations, do not really understand how vital real estate is to an organization. And they do think it's all about the rent. Yeah. And they fail to negotiate the subsidies and the little details that unfortunately hamstring them through the middle of the lease term once they have the lease time.
Yeah. And Scott, you and I started talking on LinkedIn. Can't remember how we connected. And right. The conversation went along the lines of, oh, Kevin, can I send you a copy of my book? And that book is called It's Not All About the Rent. So, Scott, tell me more about that. Why isn't it all about the rent?
Yeah, so going back to our earlier conversation, I'll recap it. But the title of the book says it all, in that everybody who starts out in life, when they move away from their parents' home, at some point they're going to rent an apartment, a dorm room, a house, whatever. You show up, you sign the lease, you're done. But everybody has that kind of stuck in their head. Now, let me preface by saying this does not have to do with the big corporations, Apple's, the Google, what we call a CRE, a commercial real estate executive. There are seasoned pros. There's people like me. They run real estate for the organization. But for most companies, there are 20 person to 500 people, maybe even 1,000 people. Oftentimes, they, not to sound silly, but a lot of people think, hey, I'm a great negotiator. I can negotiate better than you. They think they've got a great deal based purely on the rental rate or free rent, but they fail to negotiate a lot of details such as planning the space, how much does the construction cost, how much does the land, is there a shortfall, is there building issues, are there code compliance issues, is there a strategy around the real estate? And they really let the wag the dog, where they're shoehorned in versus proper planning. If the company needs to exit in 3 years, don't sign a lease longer than 3 years. Just don't do it. You really need to develop the real estate to conform with the business strategy and not the other way around. Because make no mistake about it, landlord, all great. They're in the business of making money just like a tenant is. And rest assured, commercial real estate value is all based on tenant receipts, just like tenants. The greater volume they sell, the greater valuation. The greater the rent, the greater the building. I always respond and say, really? Don't pay your rent for a couple months and see how your relationship about it. It's the devil's in the details. There's a lot of details there.
Yeah. And you're describing that small, medium, but not mega huge company. And I think a lot of the time the finance lead, the CFO, ends up getting all of those responsibilities that don't naturally fit with anybody else. So real estate, chances are the real estate, you'll have somebody that's doing sales in a smaller organization. You'll have a CSO. You might have a CMO. You might have a CHRO looking after people. The chances that you've got somebody that's looking after property and legal are very small until your company gets quite big. And those tend to all be things that come back to the CFO. So thinking about that, Scott, and that can be typical of our audience, they'll all be managing property. What are those key pieces of advice that you'd be giving to a CFO? And our CFOs are very finance savvy, but what are the sort of things that you typically see people missing and getting wrong?
Missing or getting wrong kind of fall in. To expand upon the portion as mentioned about developing a real estate plan or strategy that conforms to the business strategy, devils that they get wrong would be just a handful of items would be such that they feel like they've got a great rental rate. They feel like they've got great concessions. The landlord's going to build out the space. They're going to give them free rent, et cetera. Real estate works a bit differently in other parts of the world than it does in the U.S. But for this conversation, it's one and the same because it's the tenant's responsibility for pretty much most things. But they fail to ensure that the landlord will keep the building systems in good condition and order. Oftentimes, companies get into the building. The AC doesn't work. Then the landlord needs to charge them through the operating expenses or the CAM charges or the triple nets. I'm using a uniform word here. The roof might leak. The tenant says, hey, I need to build out a few offices. Well, outside the building might not be up to current governmental codes in terms of the American Disabilities Act, probably similar acts, obviously in the UK, fire compliance, etc. And so due to the building not being in compliance, unless you negotiated the landlord pay for those compliance upgrades, the tenant pays for them. The other thing that I often see getting completely twisted up is, and this has happened a few times, tenants will not negotiate proper transfer and assignment provisions. We're living in a venture capital world, right? And companies need to sell, they need to raise equity. And so you need to also forecast that because landlords will typically have a standard form / language such that in the event the company sells more than X percent, 25, 50%, the landlord needs to approve of that equities or that exit. You don't want the landlord doing that. Other things might be as simple as the lease term. As an example, the landlord's motive is highest rent, longest term. They want a non-interruptible business income stream, plain and simple. What does the tenant want? Ideally, a fixed rent month to month where they can terminate in perpetuity. Obviously, polar opposites. So where's the middle? Well, on an average lease cycle, the UK is typically 10 years. The US is between 5 and 7. And this is depending upon how much improvements are faced in the construction and complexity of the facility. But as an example, 5 years, and I've done plenty in the UK. But if the landlord is stringent and sticking to a term that is longer than the business is comfortable, whether it be 5 years or 7 years, obviously market pending, but the business wants an exit in 3 years, or they need to raise a round, they need to do a merger or some type of event that will change the course of the business trajectory, imperative not sign a lease term that's longer than that end date. However, if you need to sign that, then it's worth negotiating a termination right. Even if it costs a fair amount of money, conversely, if you don't have that, even though the termination penalty might be quite expensive, the opposite is far worse. I would say the last thing, just to hit on a handful of topics, is that the securitization of the company. So, for example, anybody that's going to obtain lending from a bank, the bank's going to want to see the person or the company's financials for the sole purpose to ensure the loan gets paid. Similar with a real estate lease, right? What landlords like to do is negotiate a very simple term sheet. Here's the rent, here's your term, the construction, the parking, a 1-page, 2-page sheet. The other items I mentioned, you want to obviously negotiate and bake into the term sheet so you don't get to the lease and now you're 9 months pregnant, if you will, or at the altar, and you don't really have an option to go back just due to time factors. But in terms of the underwriting or the deposit on the lease, if you're a company outside of a big mega corporation, big tech, fairly standard to a 1 month security deposit. However, startups, companies that are not profitable yet, they're still on a burn rate, and they're looking like the drug companies. They're looking for liquidity where they're never going to be profitable. They're just going to sell into big pharma. Imperative that the underwriting of the deposit is done at the time that you start the negotiations of trading paper, as we call it, the term sheet. You don't want to get to basically a deal that's half baked. And now the landlord knows you spent 3 months doing all these items, negotiating. And he says, by the way, I want $1 million in deposit. So they have to be by the, if you know what I mean. So it's important to negotiate these salient items that will materially change the company's way of doing business at the very onset, well before the lease document.
Yeah, that's a very good point, Scott, that there's a certain amount of time that takes place from the realizing, we need some new premises, through to moving into those. You invest a lot of time and effort. So if, say, it's a 6-month process, you're 3 months down there, you don't want to suddenly say, no, that deal's not working for me, and go back to the start and look for another one.
That's right.
You want to avoid that. So I can see really that why you need to get all these things out right at the beginning.
Correct. And make no mistake, none of these things that I'm mentioning here are rocket science. They're all people, when you kind of share it, wow, yeah, okay, that makes total sense. We're not in anything new. However, they're so simple that it's quite unfortunate whereby, to use a simple example, another really big kind of hiccup is a company will sign a lease. The landlord will say they're going to construct offices or a laboratory, whatever the case may be. The landlord might give them a construction allowance to build the space and show them a bid. Great, it'll cover it. The tenant feels comfortable. They feel like they trust the landlord. Lease is signed. Down the road, how often does the construction actual cost come in with the estimate? Zero. It pays for the overage, the tenant. So super simple. So it's imperative. I don't want to go into the details now, but there's really a handful of certain things, if done properly, very easily to avoid. I just think from a general rule, most people fail to put together call it a 10 bullet point outline where you've got the business plan, you calculate your future space needs, what type of space you need. And at the end of the day, it always takes longer than you think. People, number one, almost always underestimate the length of time it takes to get a real estate transaction completed. And that kind of goes back to the mention of, all right, well, everybody has in their head, I rented a house, I rented an apartment. That's different. You're dealing with one person to one person. You've got a big company, which typically the landlord has multiple layers. They've got code compliance, legal requirements. Then you've got a tenant that's got employees. They've got legal requirements, governance, et cetera, as well. And the reality of it is it just always takes longer than one anticipates. And I would say this is more imperative in terms of a financial implication on the lease renewal. The little dirty secret, if you will, is that landlords make the most money renewing a tenant, upwards of, they roughly have 40% room below the quoted market rent. So for example, if the market rent for a particular building, I'm just making this up, is $1 per square foot per month. If you run a break-even analysis, assuming the tenant will vacate, the landlord will suffer 6, 9, 12 months plus of downtime. They'll have to put more money of construction to rehab the space. You flatten out, the break-even is around 60 cents on the dollar where the landlord can afford to renew the tenant. Now, having said that, are you going to get 60 cents on the dollar? Of course not. But oftentimes companies wait until the point of 6 months or 3 months before the lease expires, and they have zero leverage because you want to have other landlords who have vacancies compete for your tenancy to drive down your renewal rent. But one of I would say, the biggest value adds in the business.
Yeah. Thinking about that renewal, certainly if you leave it too late to start thinking about that negotiations, you're in a very bad negotiating position. So it's definitely not all about that first agreement. Tell you where probably I've had most of my experience dealing with a property portfolio. It was with my last consulting company. And we ended up being a very profitable company that had turned into a great loss-making company. The reasons were around the UK. Our sole client was the UK government. All sorts of places in the UK government we project managed, helped them outsource things and so on. And 2010, we had a general election in the UK. We elected a new government and we went into something called austerity, where government realized they'd been spending far too much money and had to make some serious cutbacks. And as a result, our revenue line plummeted. We'd been a company that had grown by acquisition, grown very fast by acquisition. And there was a lovely strategy there that said, we've got a great multiple on revenue on earnings. Let's buy lots of companies that have got a much smaller multiple, bring them into our organization. Guess what? The value of those companies goes up overnight because no longer are they being valued by their multiple. We're now valuing the combined business by a much higher multiple. It's a great policy. Company expanded. What they didn't do was any real post-acquisition integration. So I got involved in the Save the Company transformation project. And there were two lines to it. Number one was, how do we sort out these back offices? Because we had 7 finance functions, 7 HR functions, where we should have only had one.
A lot of duplication.
And the other place we had huge duplication was in the property portfolio, because every company that was acquired had people. It was mostly a people business. We had a property portfolio that had not been rationalized at all, no attempt to rationalize it. So we had, in a very similar geography, we might have 3 different buildings, each being occupied by different divisions of the same company. No attempt to rationalize into one space. We realized that actually because our revenue had fallen away so much, we'd lost lots and lots of heads, lots of people out the door, and we had too much property. The issue we hit on was that it wasn't necessarily getting out of the best property strategically to get out of. It was get out of the one that we get out of the easiest, the one that possibly had the shorter lease, the one with the fewer costs to get out of. And I've seen that way, Scott, the real price to be paid for not having a decent estate strategy.
That's correct. Yeah. Question for you, Kevin. When you acquire the smaller companies with a lower multiple, during due diligence, did you underwrite the real estate as it relates to what the current properties had, how in terms of the square footage, the lease payments, and or whether you would retain that facility after you rolled it up?
I honestly don't know the answer to that question, Scott, because I was never involved in that part of the company.
Okay.
I was an employee of one of the later acquisitions. Funnily enough, on this podcast, I've had as a guest a member of the finance team from the parent company who was involved in doing a lot of the deals. And we had a very interesting discussion on the podcast about business valuation, what made a good deal. But we never went into the detail of looking at the due diligence from that point of view. So, Scott, tell me what you would put into the due diligence process if you're acquiring a company. What would you put in the due diligence around it?
So I've actually been asked this before. That's why I brought the topic up. So as an example, when I went back to talking about if there is a plan with the business to exit in 3 years, change the course, whatever, it's important to not sign a lease longer than that period of time. And as it relates to, I've had clients where they do M&A and they roll up smaller companies. And more often than not, during their due diligence, they will contact me. They'll have me look at the lease. And the question is, Scott, can you tell me, are we at market? Are we below market? Are we above market? And I'll ask them, or I'll obviously share them my advice. Then they'll tell me, we plan to keep the building. And if they plan to keep the building, okay, that's a different set of strategy, right? If they have a year left, okay, what's the strategy to renew? If they have several years left and they're going to keep it, no pain there, leave it alone. But if they're not going to keep the real estate, then the strategy is completely different. I'll do what's called a disposition analysis. So for example, if the company is going to acquire a smaller company and the plan is to just buy the IP and shut that location down or have a skeleton crew, then they're going to ask me to do a disposition analysis because in their mind, they want to get rid of the real estate. So as an example, if company A is trying to buy company B and company B, upon the close date of the acquisition, let's just say has X number of years left, but they have $1 million of liability in remaining lease payments. On average, in a good market, which we're not in now, right? Real estate recovery is roughly 70% plus or minus on the dollar. In other words, if that company were to put the space on the market for sublease, because no landlord's going to let you buy out or terminate a lease unless you have it in writing in the lease. But to go to a landlord and say you want to buy out, they're going to want you to pay 80 cents on the dollar unless they have somebody to come in and fill it. So worst case scenario, which is often the case, is the landlord's going to go to the tenant and say, you guys are on the hook, you go sublease it. So that means that if the company A buys company B with $1 million of liability, at best, they're going to recoup $700,000 because it probably takes 6 months, a year to get the space sublet. They're going to take probably 30 cents on the dollar, 20 cents. There's going to be a discount because they're not going to be the benefits. You're a subtenant. You don't have the rights. You don't have improvement allowances, et cetera. In a bad market like we're in today, it could be 50 cents on the dollar. So just as an argument's sake, let's just take 60%. If a company has $1 million of liability, and I'll tell them, you're only going to recoup 600,000. So they're going to eat 400. They'll take that 400 and lob it off the purchase price of company B. So that happens actually quite a bit. So that's why it's imperative when I mentioned it's vital to keep consistent as it relates to the lease term, and not go longer based upon future events that are planned.
So it really does highlight that thing if you're looking at an exit of some sort, whether it's a sale, a merger, whatever.
Right.
If you're looking to get best value for your business, then that really is then imperative to make sure that the deals on your various bits of real estate aren't vastly longer than that sort of exit date, because it is going to take money off the valuation of the business. The way
That's correct. That's right. The other thing is, it's important to keep in mind, I would put this in two buckets. So we're obviously not in the COVID funding era. During the COVID funding era, which obviously ballooned the life science industry. You're in the life science industry, you're in the drug company business. It takes billions of dollars to bring a drug to market. They want to hire the best talent, recruit. At the end of the day, none of this matters because it's binary. You either go big and make it, or you go big and you don't get drug approval by the government and you fail. So whether you have $1 million or $5 million in remaining lease liability, it doesn't matter. For those companies, it's a little bit different. But for most companies that obviously want to go to profitability or want to grow revenues for a liquidity event or some other reason to just keep the company growing long term, it's really important to say have a beggars can't be choosers attitude. In other words, everybody wants nice, great, the most perfect space for recruiting. They want expansion space. They don't want to be in 2 suites. After 25 years, I always tell this to people, even friends that I've represented over the past. I say, look, unless you're big tech and you can afford to land bank space, meaning just buy it or lease it for the future and sit on it, don't do it. It's better to be in a smaller space. It's better to be in a shorter term lease. It's better to be in a little bit of downgrade space and do it shorter term, because when the company is growing, because everybody's worried about they're going to grow out of their space. Well, that's a good problem to have because everybody's pumped up. You're growing, you're hiring, you're jammed, the synergy's there. If you bite off too much space, or the space is just built like you're planning so much for success, and if it doesn't go that way, and you need more runway, you can't get it because you're in that real estate lease, which is one of the top 3 fixed expense categories after payroll, as you know. And the whole vibe turns sour. They've got to stroke a check every month. They're swimming in space. It's completely the opposite. So it's kind of important to be a little bit realistic at what stage of the company that you're in, because it's just not going to be perfect at the end of the day. You're just not going to get the perfect space at an earlier stage at the company's life cycle, for the most part, if you will.
You started there talking about COVID. We came out of COVID and we saw a great transition from working in the office to working at home. What's your feeling at the moment about that situation? Are we starting to go back to the office, or are we in a situation that companies are left with a huge amount of underutilized space now as a result of that?
Unfortunately, the latter in the US. In other countries, as you and I were discussing at the opening, the Asian markets are a bit different. It sounds like the UK is a little bit between Asia and the US, where Asia, at least from China's perspective, they're all back in the office. But in the US, it's a detrimental problem. While you do have some big tech companies or public announcements from obviously big tech leaders like the Elon Musks that mandate back to work or no job, the overwhelming majority of companies do not have a post-COVID plan. And it all stemmed from the quiet quitting, if you will, post-COVID, where people weren't working much just to keep their job. But now that the economy has changed a bit, on average, most companies will need to cut 1/3 to 1/2 of their facility on the office component. And this is not all this conversation, by the way, is not retail. I don't work in retail. It's a bit different. The real estate product types that I'm referring to are office, industrial, such as warehousing. It could be R&D, research and development, where half of it is warehouse, half of it's office, or the back half is electronics, or it could be biotechnology space, but not hospital, not hotels, your typical corporate real estate space. The office component is really the key mention there, where 1/3 to 1/2 reduction. Half of my customers are in the biotech business, half of them are in the tech business. When you go into the biotech facilities, roughly 50% of the space is laboratory, 50% of the space is office. Well, the laboratory is fine. People are in there. Those are people that need to move stuff and do stuff and test and whatever. But in the office space, it's half or 1/3 full or 2/3 full. It's not very full. On the warehousing component, those are still quite occupied in terms of warehousing, industrial spaces. The majority of the problem and the over excess space capacity as it stands is the office portion of most spaces.
Big advantage, therefore, if you're coming up to the end of a lease. Lots of alternative accommodation available. Essentially, a time to have a really good negotiation with your current landlord. That current landlord will be frightened of losing tenants.
100%. Well, here's something that is not talked about in the media at all. I see a completely different world than the average person. So in the US, it's very common that everybody knows there are trillions of commercial real estate debt maturing in the next 2 to 4 years. Trillions. Okay. I would not be surprised if there's not another bank fallout. Commercial real estate debt, the average fixed interest rate for a commercial real estate loan for an industrial building, office building, it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, or 10 years. Most often they do 5 years and 7 years. All right. They'll buy it, they'll renovate it, they'll lease it up, boost the value. At some point they refinance it. We've all been living on Kool-Aid with 3%, 4% interest rates. Now they're double. Okay. But you have landlords that have trillions of debt coming due over the next 2 to 4 years, double the interest rates. Even if they go down to 6, you still have a 1.5x kicker. This is a double whammy, coupled with the fact that the average lease term for most companies in the US are 5 years, sometimes 7, not the big campuses, coupled with the fact that all these companies are likely to not renew they're not likely, they are not renewing all of their space. So when you have interest rates rising and you have the occupancy of the building decreasing, because everybody's trying to sublease their space, nobody wants it. Companies have just gotten numb to it. Hey, we'll just ride it out. We won't renew our whole lease. So if you have a building declining in occupancy, it goes down in value. The interest rate goes up. The landlord, when they refinance, they're going to have to cut a check to make the equity difference. There are already multiple buildings across the U.S., unfortunately, in default. It is a very slow fuse that is candidly just started in 2024.
That's certainly nothing that I'm aware of from what I've read in the press.
I know.
I see that as a very real problem.
It's super difficult. In fact, the 3 main hubs in the United States for biotechnology companies are Boston area, San Francisco, and San Diego. There's some secondary markets, but those 3 just got absolutely overbuilt because when the funding through COVID came, companies expanded, leased up all the space. Landlords raced to buy buildings and land and convert and build. But everybody knows it takes 2 to 3 years to build real estate. So now in 24 and 25, they're all finishing construction, and the market for demand of that space type has absolutely cooled. Office has been crushed for 5 years, for 4 years. It's similarly with industrial space. When everything started shifting to e-commerce, Amazon blew up, all the e-commerce blew up. Landlords raced to build a lot of industrial warehouse space. Now that's overbuilt. 2024 is the first year we are seeing industrial supply warehousing space. It's doubled in the first 2 quarters of 2024 compared to the same in 2023. So it's just a very slow fuse, conversely with '08, where it was just the atomic bomb that went off and everybody nuked and it went down. I don't think we're going to hit bottom for at least a year and a half. Even if interest rates rise, the fact of the matter is companies just don't want all the space and they're being ultra conservative given what's happened in the economy.
And there's got to be a hope that interest rates will have fallen by the time this becomes a real problem. That's still, as you say, only removes half of the
Right.
revenue.
Yeah, super difficult problem, and the media just doesn't report about it, unfortunately. But it's my job on a day-to-day basis is I walk through warehousing, technology, office every day, all day, and I never have a problem parking. There's nobody in the lobbies. There's nobody in the restrooms of a building that has multiple tenants in it. It's troubling.
It's yet another reason why perhaps people moving back to the office from working at home could be a good thing. And I've spoken on this podcast to probably 3 or 4 finance leaders in fintech companies where they're operating a remote workforce. And the advantage they've got is that they've now got workforces that are geographically spread over a vast area. They've got a far bigger pool of talent they can tap into. So we talked before we started recording about the disadvantages of remote work. But one of the big advantages is cheaper labor, wider choice of labor. It's a very difficult one to square off.
Yeah, it's really hard because there are a lot of advantages. And as I mentioned before, our headquarters is in San Diego, but I'm remote a bit just because it's 40 minutes to drive. But I've been remote for 10 years because I'm at client sites. However, there are a lot of advantages, but I just think it's going to take a number of years to slowly work itself out and find the proper balance, because pre-COVID, the mandate and the norm and the habits were go to the office. Well, now during COVID is up in the air, went all the way to one side, and now we're slowly trying to figure out where's the middle ground, because it really depends upon the type of company, how tenured you are in business, if you're a self-starter, if you're working on collaborative projects. There's so many variables that will either swing the value benefits, if you will, working from home or not. And I think that's been a pretty troublesome fact for most companies to really pin down and factor out.
Yeah. I think we need a good crystal ball to work out where that's all going to end up.
We all need a crystal ball. Yes.
Scott, on that note, thank you for being this week's guest on the Grow CFO Show.
Thank you, Kevin. I appreciate it.